Greetings and thank you for joining us today. I'm Naima Hall, the Director of the Center for Student Professional Development and the Director of Student Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Programs within STHM. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Deborah Blair, Associate Professor and Director of Organizational Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as two guest experts, Dr. Bridget R. McCurtis and Justin Woods. We are incredibly pleased to welcome you to this edition of Diversity Speaks. Now, before I transition the conversation over to our two guest experts to allow space for them to introduce themselves, I want to take a moment to applaud STHM's first ever and all inclusive STHM Community Edition of Diversity Speaks. This is a series that is dedicated to nurturing and creating critical conversations within the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We entitled today's talk Check Yourself, in which our conversation will focus on emotional intelligence and how it relates to DEI competency. We will also discuss how emotional intelligence impacts how we manage ourselves, regulate our emotions, and foster inclusive relationships. We will open the dialogue with a 15-minute group listening session in which both Justin and Dr. McCurtis will provide their insights to the topic, and then we will disperse into breakout sessions for a more intimate conversation between faculty, staff, students, and alumni. After which we will then reconvene for our final thoughts from both of our guest speakers. Now, Dr. McCurtis, let's open this dialogue with you. Can you briefly share with our participants your background and work in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And in addition to that, can you offer your perspective on how emotional intelligence drives diversity and inclusion, and what is its relevancy to conversations around equity issues?
So my name is Bridget McCurtis, and I am the founder and chief education officer for Beyond Measure Coaching and Consulting. And so I do, ultimately, I really do diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. And that looks like, I usually do that through a sense of assessment, education, and strategy and integration. That often is coaching, it is teaching, it is looking at organizational structure, strategy, goals, etc. So I am not the person who comes in and says, you now want your organization to be all about diversity, because I know that's generally not true. And so I look at what's the mission of the organization, what are the goals, what's the culture, and let's look at what things in that culture organization that we can weave diversity, equity, inclusion through. And so I decided to work for myself because I was doing more good outside of one institution, because you know when you work for one institution you sometimes have responsibilities that that institution only wants for them. And I really think my ability to think critically and put an eye on diversity as well as talent and excellence makes me a better consultant than it did at my last job, and I was pretty good there too, as an assistant vice provost at NYU, where I did hold a faculty appointment, but I primarily also ran an academic program, and my research is around racial identity and socially responsible leadership. And so all of those things together over the years, most of my career has been with mission-driven organizations, and I'm a Gen Xer. And so I've been told that you don't bring your emotions to work. 10 of my years has been coaching students who work in corporate America. So you especially don't bring that to work at that point, but there was a piece that was always missing. So while I understood unconscious and conscious bias, I taught many emotional intelligence classes, and there wasn't a discussion about the intersection of them. Yes, we're talking about people's emotions and who they are, but we didn't always really tap into the core and the emotional piece. So I'm a person who uses all of my senses, including intuition, in the work that I do, and that sort of makes me a little different. So I'm a person who believes in metaphysicians or metaphysical, so in the concept of being who you are right now, and so emotions go beyond what we typically think about our general emotions. And so all of those things together, I'm fortunate to be able to use to help people tap into and uncover who they are, not just in their salient identities, but also their experiences with them that really drive how they work with other people. And as well, for you to tap into how looking at other people and trying to not figure them out per se, but having a better understanding and being in touch with your emotions, you're able to hear them in a different way. And so it really, it's about creating communication and dialogue that helps to support beyond the concepts of access opportunity.
Excellent, wonderful. So you actually answered that second part of that
Oh, sorry.
question. No, that's wonderful in understanding how emotional intelligence drives some of these DEI conversations that we're having. So Justin, I pose the same question to you. If you could be so kind, share a little bit about your background, and then also could you talk a little bit about how how emotional intelligence drives diversity and inclusion and what the relevancy is to those conversations?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here, and I appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to join us for this important conversation and something that is really at the core of, what I believe in professionally and personally. So thank you for your time. Yeah, to give you a little bit of context about myself, I'm coming out of undergrad. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Rwanda. I spent about 2 years there teaching English and extended my service to transition to do some health equity work, working with a small Rwandan NGO. I mean, that was important work to me because as a queer person, it was important that I, use my privilege and try and engage the larger global LGBT community. And so that meant doing HIV work there in Rwanda. After that, I came back to the US, continued doing a lot of work around HIV prevention because I knew that was something that directly and disproportionately impacted a community that I'm part of, particularly Black, gay, and bisexual men and trans women of color. And so it was important after having spent a lot of time working on issues that are important, in a global context, that I come back and work on issues that are important, to a community that I'm a part of here in the US. And what I was really interested in is addressing some of those racial health disparities. So we know that HIV, disproportionately, impacts, queer men or men who have sex with men. But even within that, Black men were being disproportionately impacted by that. And the more, kind of to do some, public health research and really understand the epidemic, the more I learned that it really isn't any unique behaviors that, Black gay men or trans women are engaging in, but it's really systemic racism that is driving, a lot of the disparities that we see around health. And we think about some of those social determinants of health. So, how much money do you have? How much education were you able to attain? Where do you live in a city? What's your access to health insurance? Those things are what really drive health outcomes. And so, if I really want to do that work of addressing those racial health disparities, it became very clear to me that I needed to engage in dialogue and action around race. And, the more I start to talk about, racism or white supremacy, or just bring up race generally, it became very clear that people quickly get pretty uncomfortable. These are emotionally charged topics in our country. And oftentimes, people, may have a loud outburst, other people may shut down. And it was just so clear to me that we can't really have effective dialogue on these topics unless we really have that emotional intelligence and that ability to navigate our emotions in a healthy and successful way so we can have dialogue. And so that, I was at a point in my life where transitioning into grad school. I'm currently a dual master's student at the University of Michigan, getting degrees in social work and business, because I really have, because I've been working on my dream here of starting a social venture that focuses on using emotional intelligence as a way to advance racial equity. And so just, to talk a little bit more about emotional intelligence and how it's related to diversity and inclusion, I think this spring, when COVID is really coming onto the scene and starting to, impact society on a meaningful way. And, within academia, classes were going, were going online, and there was, an outbreak of, this anti-Asian bias. And I remember I was on a Zoom call with some participants from a DEI certificate program that we have here at the University of Michigan. And so to give you some context, these are about 30 or 40 people who, through the program, had gone through about 10 trainings on diversity and inclusion. And in addition to that, they had to conduct an interview around DE&I, and they had to write a diversity statement. So these are people who, in theory, have been really trained and should be equipped and ready to go to engage people on diversity and inclusion. And so we're having a dialogue about how do we engage this anti-Asian bias that, we're starting to see related to COVID. And it was so striking to me that, a lot of the dialogue began with, well, I don't really know how to talk about these things, or I'm afraid I may offend someone, or I'm afraid of, how people may respond, or I'm not sure how to respond if somebody has a really strong emotional reaction. And in that moment, I was just struck that, these people have gone through all the diversity and inclusion trainings, yet there was clearly a discomfort or some underdevelopment around navigating emotion. And that was really what was keeping them from being effective around diversity and inclusion. And so consistent with, kind of my personal, belief that emotional intelligence really precedes engagement in diversity and inclusion. That was, a real life example just this year of, again, how emotional intelligence, our ability to identify and understand our emotions, to regulate them, to be able to see how we can use our emotions to motivate ourselves to get into some of these uncomfortable dialogues and take uncomfortable action, and how to empathize and navigate the emotions of others, I think is critical to really advancing diversity and inclusion. And so that led me to founding my social venture, Equity, which does just that. It provides skill-based training around emotional intelligence. I'm rooted in topics related to racial justice and diversity and inclusion more broadly. And so I was glad, to see that Temple is really focusing in on that intersection, because I really do think it's critical that emotional intelligence really does precede engaging on diversity and inclusion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Justin and Dr. McCurtis, for that. Now, let's do our breakout rooms. We want to have a more intimate conversation further and diving into this topic and unveiling some of these concepts that are really difficult to talk about, but let's have it more specific to your affiliation with STHM. So, Dr. Blair, if you could you open up our breakout rooms?
All right,
One for Justin, one for Bridget.
Everyone should be getting a signal now, and when we come back into the room, we'll be able to shoot a message to everyone to let you know when we're going to come back and do a debrief. Okay.
All right, welcome back, folks. Hopefully you had a really engaging, intimate, and exciting conversation about DEI, emotional intelligence, and how the two intersect and play into our abilities to be competent in having these critical conversations surrounded by DEI issues. So I want to now transition this over to our final thoughts by our two guest experts. We will start with Justin, and then we will let Dr. McCurtis kind of wrap us up for today. So Justin, final thoughts and things we can share with the entire group inclusively.
Sure. I think, I think it's just important to acknowledge that these are emotionally charged conversations. We're all coming from them from different experiences. We all hold different identities that shape how we move about the world. And we, maybe have unique barriers and some of us unique privileges based on the identities that we hold. I think, but yet in saying that, something that is human and something that we share in common is that we're emotional beings, that we all have emotional responses to these things. And that can be a bridge for us to connect with one another. And so, I would just, encourage, the more that you can be aware of how you feel, regulate how you feel, that's going to enhance your ability to stay engaged in this dialogue, to stay engaged in action, and to continue to be a change maker. And I hope that, everyone who's, part of this dialogue is now walking away with some additional tools. And so I hope that you can, employ them strategically, and, be the expert in that dialogue now around emotional intelligence. How can you help someone else identify how they feel? How can you help someone else regulate those emotions when you're having that dialogue? Because it's critical. We won't get anywhere if we can't navigate how we feel emotionally in a moment. So thanks again for everyone showing up. And I am optimistic and hopeful that you can take something that you learned from today and use it for good.
Thank you. Dr. McCurtis.
So I'm going to say give and take space. And so we use that language where people are saying, don't take up too much space, depending on who you are. If you have privilege, now is the time where we need everybody to speak. So if anybody's been following critical race theory, one of the very important concepts of is interest convergence. We need everybody for us to address the challenges and the realities that we are going through, regardless of how you feel about them. Everybody has to be in the conversation. So I talked to faculty about making sure giving that space up front so that students can have a space as well as we can have a space to acknowledge where we are. But what I didn't talk about that I think is really important for everyone to think about is giving space for people to grow. So if you have, let's say, worked with your colleague, your peer, your group member, your administrator you go see, if you've been working with them for 3 years, they have a certain understanding of you. And so because you are having a different experience or a different awareness now, understand that they won't get on board the next day. And so I'm finding a lot of times where, yelling at people or we're exhausted, we're saying, I don't understand why you don't get it, because I haven't been thinking about this for 20 years. You have in a different way. And so that's not the excuse for I don't have to do it, but I think we have to make sure we give space on the front end to have the conversations because the dialogue is so important, and have it with people who have a broad sense of all the pieces, not just our opinions, but those who know the research, those who know practice, and then making sure you give that space for change, for you to think differently. Unexamined traditions are dangerous. I heard that years ago, and I think about it probably several times a week. And it's true, oftentimes we operate in this is our culture, this is our theme. but we really have to examine those things and allow space for those things to change, be enhanced, and to continue what's good.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. McCurtis. Thank you, Justin. And it's evident that the conversation cannot stop here. So folks, if you enjoyed today's dialogue, if you appreciated the expertise that was afforded to you through today's discussion, we'll ask you to join us again next month when we have our next Diversity Speak series, and we'll continue the conversation and dive a little deeper. I always say, when you involve in these types of dialogues, it's like peeling back an onion. Every time you get through a layer, the conversation gets more raw, right? And it gets more real. So thank you all today. I appreciate you all taking time to dedicate to educating yourself, becoming more aware, and diving into these conversations. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.